Well, meanwhile, the African Union has called on President Jammeh to revert to his original stance and hand over power to Adama Barrow. CCTV has learned that the AU is working with the regional body ECOWAS to convince Jammeh to accept the poll results and step down. Here's more from CCTV's Girum Chala.
The U-turn by President Yahya Jammeh is still a surprise for the African Union leadership here. That is why both the chairperson of the Union, Idris Deby of Chad, and the Commission's chair, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, have issued serious statements. Both President Deby and Dlamini Zuma have called President Jammeh to still respect his words and peacefully pass power to the newly elected leader. In doing so, the African Union says the 20-plus years leader respects the choice of the people of the Gambia. The chair of the African Union, Idris Deby, called Gambia's security forces and stakeholders to exercise restraint and maintain the rule of law in the country until peaceful and orderly transition of power takes place as soon as possible. We have learned the African Union, together with ECOWAS, are working jointly to convince President Yahya Jammeh go back to his original stand and give up his power to President-elect Adama Barrow. Girum Chala, CCTV at the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa.
Well, let's get to more now from our UN correspondent, Liling Tan in New York. Liling, of course, the UN has already asked the incumbent president of Gambia to hand over power after his election defeat. What more can the UN do in its efforts to ensure that there is a peaceful political transition in the country?
That's right. Both the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and also the 15-member UN Security Council have condemned President Yahya Jammeh's rejection of the election results and have called on him to accept the outcome. And this is a worrying development for the United Nations. In fact, the UN Security Council is holding an urgent meeting behind closed doors on Gambia to hear the latest update from the Undersecretary General for Political Affairs, Jeffrey Feltman, who will also brief them on diplomatic efforts that have been underway during this electoral process. Now, the UN, what more can it do? The UN can exert more pressure on the government of President Jammeh to accept the election results. It can opt to mediate as well. And if the situation deteriorates to the point where there might be civil unrest or violent clashes, the UN can also it can also impose sanctions. So there are a range of options for the United Nations to insert itself into this, but of course the UN is limited in that it cannot force the president's hand.
And that is exactly the dilemma, isn't it? I mean, where should the international community essentially draw the line between respecting the internal processes of an independent state while at the same time trying to restore constitutional order in a post-election dispute?
Very good question. In fact, that's something that the UN has long grappled with. Now, while the UN has to respect the internal process of a government, what happens if the government doesn't respect its own election results, as we've seen? What happens if that situation deteriorates, violent clashes erupt, and there's a potential that civil unrest could spill over into the region? Well, the UN can't really do much because it's beyond its jurisdiction to compel the government to accept the results of the election. The UN can persuade, it can mediate, and it can impose sanctions. But as we've seen in the past in in other political crises, these measures don't always reap results. In Syria, Burundi, South Sudan, Libya, whether the UN is mediating or imposing sanctions, these don't go very far. And the line between respecting sovereignty and restoring constitutional stability becomes even more blurred when countries outside of, separately from the UN, intervene themselves, either directly or by proxy, by either supporting opposite sides in a conflict or providing weapons. So that line becomes so much more blurred, and it's not something the UN can control or manage.
Indeed, it is a difficult process. Liling Tan there live for us in New York on the UN stance on that situation there in Gambia.